The chamber was hushed, the kind of silence that presses against the skin like a storm before it breaks. All eyes shifted toward Clarence Thomas as he leaned back in his chair, lips curled into a smirk that dripped with disdain. Then came the words, measured, slow, and sharp as a dagger. A sneer about Jasmine Crockett's law degree, a dismissal that wasn't just about her credentials, but about everything she represented. It was arrogance dressed as humor, a laugh at her expense meant to belittle, to humiliate, to remind everyone of the hierarchy he believed unshakable. The moment landed like a slap in the room. A few chuckles rippled among his allies, hollow and uneasy, but most people froze. Cameras zoomed in, catching the flicker of triumph in his eyes, as though he had just delivered the knockout blow in a contest Jasmine was foolish to enter. This was supposed to be his arena, his stage. He was the Goliath, towering with decades of power and prestige, and she, by his calculation, was merely a challenger to swat aside. Yet in that silence, something shifted. The viewers at home could feel it too. You didn't have to know Jasmine Crockett personally to sense it. The disrespect wasn't aimed only at her, but at anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Anyone who had ever worked twice as hard just to be laughed at by someone born into advantage. The scene was cinematic, bright lights glaring overhead, the contrast of polished wood and dark suits, the glint of camera lenses catching every nuance. It was a battlefield without swords, but the wounds were real. Every word Thomas spoke carried the weight of centuries of condescension, of power wielded not as stewardship, but as a weapon. And there sat Jasmine, calm, steady, her expression unreadable. While his allies smirked, she didn't flinch. No eye roll, no quick retort, just silence. A silence that burned hotter than fire. Viewers leaned forward, sensing the storm coiling just beneath her composure. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was dignity against arrogance, truth against mockery, David against Goliath. The insult hung in the air like smoke, choking, suffocating. But the silence that followed, that was the fuse being lit. Because what happened next left the entire country in disbelief.
For many watching that day, Clarence Thomas's sneer was not just an isolated jab. It was a moment heavy with history, weighted with centuries of power dynamics that had long shaped who gets heard in America and who gets silenced. His mockery of Jasmine Crockett's law degree may have sounded like a personal attack, but it echoed something far larger, a narrative that women, people of color, and especially women of color, must constantly prove themselves in arenas that were never designed to welcome them. This wasn't just a legal debate or a courtroom sparring match. This was politics at its rawest, where credibility is currency, and perception can outweigh truth. When Thomas leaned into his insult, he was tapping into the old playbook: discredit, diminish, belittle. To his supporters, it was entertainment. To his allies, it was reassurance that the old guard still controlled the room. But to millions of viewers at home, especially those who saw themselves in Crockett's story, it was a reminder of the uphill climb they knew too well. Jasmine Crockett had been underestimated before, written off as too young, too loud, or not seasoned enough. She had heard the whispers that she didn't belong in the same chambers as men who had spent decades cloaked in privilege. Every dismissive glance, every patronizing tone, every sly chuckle carried the weight of a gatekeeping system designed to exhaust her before she could ever ascend. And yet, here she was, sitting tall, her silence louder than his insult. What Thomas failed to grasp in that moment was that he had just crystallized the stakes. This was no longer about degrees, credentials, or technicalities. It was about who America would believe, who America would validate. Would the country side with the dismissive arrogance of an establishment figure, or with the calm resilience of a woman who represented the grit of communities long ignored? The debate had become symbolic. To some, it was about race. To others, gender. To many, it was about the age-old divide between elitism and authenticity. But in truth, It was all of those things at once, and the cameras ensured that the whole nation was watching. In that chamber, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just defending herself. She was standing in for every immigrant child told their accent was a weakness, every black woman told she was too much, every working-class student who sat in the back of the lecture hall and wondered if their degree would ever be taken seriously. She embodied the millions who had been told no 1,000 times but showed up anyway. The weight of that moment was enormous, but so was the anticipation. Viewers leaned closer, sensing that something was about to give. The tension wasn't just personal, it was generational. A torch was about to be passed, but no one yet knew whether it would be seized or crushed. And that's where the story twisted. Because what Thomas had intended as a knockout punch was about to backfire in spectacular fashion. What happens next doesn't just shift the tone of the room, it flips the script on power itself. Because Jasmine Crockett was about to answer, and her response would change everything.
Clarence Thomas did not become a figure of controversy overnight. His presence in American political life has long been a lightning rod, drawing both fierce defenders and passionate critics. To some, he is an emblem of conservative endurance, a justice who has weathered storms without ever wavering. But to many others, he is the very embodiment of arrogance, cloaked in the robe of authority, a man who speaks with the gravity of power while ignoring the moral weight that power demands. From the beginning, Thomas carried himself as though immune to criticism. Scandals, ethics questions, even the lingering shadows of his confirmation hearings never seemed to shake his composure. Instead, they seemed to fuel his confidence, as though surviving controversy became proof that he was untouchable. That confidence often crossed into something sharper, an air of superiority that left little room for humility. And nowhere was that arrogance clearer than in moments like the one with Jasmine Crockett, a man mocking the very foundation of someone else's hard-earned education, while sitting on a throne built by privilege and political maneuvering. Because here lies the contradiction. Thomas was not born into anonymity and claw his way forward through merit alone. His journey, while not devoid of hardship, was paved with opportunities and platforms that amplified his ascent. He has spent decades insulated by the prestige of the Supreme Court, a lifetime appointment that places him above the accountability faced by ordinary citizens. Yet from that lofty perch, he has often spoken down to others, dismissing, belittling, and ridiculing. To mock Crockett's law degree was not simply a jab at her. It was an extension of a pattern. Discredit the accomplishments of others while basking in the glow of his own protected status. Critics have long pointed to Thomas's deep contradictions. He rails against what he calls elitism, yet he himself has enjoyed every benefit of elite privilege. He disparages progressive voices for being out of touch, even as he enjoys the security of a position that isolates him from the very struggles millions of Americans face. He paints himself as a man of principle, yet questions about conflicts of interest, undisclosed gifts, and political alliances continue to circle around him. His image, in many ways, is built not on the clarity of truth, but on the careful curation of power. And so, when he leaned back that day, smirking as he questioned Jasmine Crockett's credentials, it was not a new chapter. It was a rerun. Audiences had seen this show before. The dismissive tone, the attempt to shrink someone else's dignity, the belief that mocking was enough to win the argument. Theatrics over substance, arrogance over dialogue. For progressive viewers, this was the Clarence Thomas they knew too well. A man who thrived not by elevating discourse, but by undercutting it. A man who seemed less interested in ideas than in dominance. Watching him smirk was frustrating not only because of what he said, but because of what it represented. How many times had others like him dismissed talent, minimized intelligence, or mocked ambition simply because it came from someone who didn't fit the mold? The hypocrisy was staggering. Here was a justice, one of the most privileged positions in the land, mocking someone who had fought her way up through obstacles he would never know. Here was a man who had secured his place in history, using that security not to mentor, uplift, or engage, but to diminish. It was a scene that made many roll their eyes, shake their heads, mutter under their breath, "Of course he would." But arrogance has a way of blinding even the most seasoned figures. In that chamber, Thomas believed he was in control. He believed his smirk and his words were enough to tip the scales, to remind everyone who held the power. What he failed to realize was that every smirk, every jab, every mocking line was not pulling Crockett down. It was setting him up for a fall. The audience could feel it. The villain was overplaying his hand, puffing himself up while ignoring the tension building around him. History has shown time and again that arrogance breeds downfall, and Clarence Thomas was writing his own setup. The more he mocked, the more transparent his insecurity became. The more he sneered, the more viewers anticipated the moment he would be silenced. And that moment was coming. His arrogance had dug the pit. His hypocrisy had sharpened the edges. All that was left was for Jasmine Crockett to deliver the push. But how could she, a first-term congresswoman, take down a titan of the old guard? That was the question hanging in the air, and the answer would shock not just the room, but the entire nation.
Long before Jasmine Crockett stepped into the chamber where Clarence Thomas mocked her, she was already familiar with the sting of being underestimated. Her journey was not one paved by legacy names or gilded networks, but by grit. The kind of grit that is born in neighborhoods where success is never handed down, only clawed toward with relentless persistence. From the start, she knew she carried labels that others would use to box her in: young, black, female, outspoken. For some, those words were marks of doubt, reasons to dismiss her before she even opened her mouth. But for Jasmine, they were fuel. Each skeptical glance, each whispered doubt, each outright dismissal hardened her resolve. If the world was going to force her to prove herself twice over, she would do it 3 times as well, leaving no question about her worth. Her path through law school was not lined with applause. It was marked by late nights, second-guessing professors, and classmates who assumed she was only there to fill a quota. Jasmine learned quickly that excellence was her armor. Every case brief, every moot court, every exam became a battleground where she refused to be overshadowed. Her degree was not just a piece of paper. It was the culmination of countless nights when she had to silence the voice of doubt and keep going. It was not given, it was earned, carved out through sleepless persistence and unshakable focus. But Jasmine was never content to simply hang her diploma on a wall and bask in personal achievement. She carried her law degree like a shield for others. She became a public defender, standing between ordinary citizens and a system stacked against them. She wasn't drawn to glamorous firms or cushy partnerships. She was drawn to the trenches, where justice was often in shortest supply. Her cases weren't headline-grabbing, but they mattered. To the families who needed her, to the young men and women who saw her as their last hope, to the communities where the law often felt like an enemy instead of a protector. This was where Jasmine's reputation began to take shape, not as someone who chased spotlight, but as someone who showed up. And yet, despite her victories, the underestimation never stopped. When she entered politics, whispers followed her. Too inexperienced, too fiery, too bold. The twos were endless, but they only revealed one thing. The establishment was not ready for someone like her, which meant, of course, that someone like her was exactly what was needed. Her first campaigns weren't fueled by corporate donors or elite networks. They were fueled by people, teachers, nurses, service workers, who saw in Jasmine a reflection of their own struggles. She knocked on doors, listened to stories, and spoke with a fire that came not from theory, but from lived reality. Slowly, she carved out her place, not because power wanted her there, but because the people demanded it. Each milestone in her career carried the same theme: underestimated at first, undeniable in the end. Her election to Congress was no different. She entered the halls of power as an outsider, someone many assumed would be overshadowed or outmaneuvered. But those who doubted her quickly discovered the steel behind her smile. She was not there to play the part of a token. She was there to legislate, to fight, to represent. Still, the dismissals kept coming, often subtle, sometimes overt. Male colleagues talked over her in committee hearings. Pundits described her as emotional when she spoke with passion. Rivals suggested she was unqualified, despite her legal career outshining many who questioned her. Through it all, Jasmine never broke. If anything, the fire inside her only grew hotter. And that's what made the insult from Thomas land so heavily for viewers who knew her story. This was not the first time she'd been mocked. It was not the first time someone tried to shrink her down with a smirk. But what separated Jasmine Crockett from so many others was her refusal to internalize the doubt. She did not let their scorn define her. She used it to sharpen her edge. Her law degree, the very credential Thomas mocked, was a symbol not of privilege, but of perseverance. It represented every locked door she had to push through, every room where she was doubted, every moment where giving up might have been easier, but was never an option. For him, degrees might be trophies. For her, they were survival. The audience watching that chamber knew this, whether consciously or in their bones. They knew her presence at that table was not an accident. It was the result of years of struggle, of courage, of refusing to disappear even when the powerful tried to push her aside. Her very existence in that room was a victory, but what she was about to do would turn that victory into something larger. Because Jasmine Crockett had been underestimated her whole life, and every time she turned doubt into fuel. Every time she transformed dismissal into momentum. Every time she proved them wrong.
The air in the chamber grew heavier with each passing second, as though the very oxygen had been thickened by tension. Clarence Thomas leaned forward now, his smugness settling into every line of his face. He had tasted his own insult like it was victory, and emboldened by that illusion, he pressed on. His words dripped with condescension, not just questioning Jasmine Crockett's law degree, but her very right to sit at the table. "You know, Congresswoman," he said with that deliberate, patronizing drawl, "some of us actually earn the respect of our peers before stepping into positions of power. Degrees are one thing. Respect, that's another." The remark stung, but Jasmine did not bite. She remained still, poised, eyes locked on him with a steadiness that unsettled those who noticed it. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to interrupt. Her calm was louder than his smugness, and the contrast was striking. Thomas took her silence as permission to continue. His voice grew sharper, his tone more dismissive. He smirked, chuckled under his breath, as if he were lecturing a student who had wandered too boldly into the master's study. It's one thing to wave around a degree. It's another to have lived long enough, worked hard enough, to understand what that piece of paper really means. Do you really think this chamber needs lessons from someone who's barely paid her dues? There it was again, the arrogance, the attempt to erase her accomplishments with a few mocking phrases. For some in the room, it was uncomfortable theater. For others, it was familiar. A man in power, leaning on seniority as though years alone equaled wisdom. But the cameras were unflinching. Every word, every smirk, every raise of his eyebrow was captured, transmitted, dissected in real time. And millions watching could see what Thomas could not. His performance was not undermining her, it was exposing him. Jasmine's calm became its own weapon. Where he was animated, she was measured. Where he smirked, she offered no reaction. Where he raised his voice, she let the silence stretch, daring him to fill it with more of his arrogance. The imbalance was palpable. To the audience, it felt less like a debate and more like a storm gathering strength, the thunder of his arrogance clashing against the quiet, immovable calm of her presence. Those in the gallery began to shift in their seats, a cough here, a stifled laugh there. The smugness Thomas projected was wearing thin, and the dignity Jasmine held was beginning to glow brighter by contrast. It was David and Goliath, not in the strike of a stone, but in the patience of waiting for the giant to topple under his own weight. Thomas, oblivious to the tightening suspense, pushed further still. "Perhaps one day you'll understand," he said, his tone dripping with false paternalism. "But until then, maybe you should take notes instead of pretending to lecture the rest of us." The words hung heavy, condescending, final, so he thought. But something was happening in that chamber, a shift invisible to him but unmistakable to everyone else. The more he spoke, the more the ground beneath him weakened. The storm was coming, and viewers everywhere could feel it building second by second. And Jasmine? She simply adjusted her microphone, leaned ever so slightly forward, and prepared to speak. The silence that followed was electric. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. For once, Thomas's smirk faltered, not because he had been struck yet, but because he sensed it. The calm before the storm was over, and what Jasmine Crockett was about to unleash would not just answer him, it would reverberate far beyond that chamber.
Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her hands folded neatly, her voice steady but low, measured in a way that forced the entire chamber to listen. "Justice Thomas," she began, not sharp, not rushed, but deliberate. Each syllable rang with the kind of clarity that silence amplifies. "You question my law degree as if it were some accident, some ornament I picked up on my way here. But unlike you, I didn't inherit my credibility. I built it." The chamber shifted. A murmur passed through the gallery, a flicker of movement across the faces of her colleagues. Crockett wasn't shouting, wasn't grandstanding. She was tutting through the air with precision, her calmness making every word sharper. "You mock my education," she continued, pausing just long enough to let the weight settle, "while you sit in one of the most privileged positions in this country, a lifetime appointment, insulated, untouchable. And yet here you are, using that privilege not to uplift the next generation, but to mock it." The silence after her words was deafening. Thomas shifted slightly, the smirk faltering. His eyes darted just for a moment to the cameras that were recording every micro-expression. He knew what millions would see, a man accustomed to dominance, suddenly unsettled. Crockett let the pause stretch before she struck again. "I've spent my career defending people who don't have a seat at this table, people who can't buy influence, who can't hide behind power, who can't laugh off injustice. Every case I took, every family I represented, every person who came to me with nothing but hope, that is where my degree lives, not in a frame on the wall, but in the work." A ripple of applause threatened to break out in the gallery, but it was quickly hushed. Still, the energy was undeniable. The audience was leaning forward, breath held, waiting for her next strike. Thomas opened his mouth, perhaps to interject, but Crockett raised her hand slightly, not as a plea, but as a command of the floor. The room obeyed. He fell silent. "Respect," she said, her voice firm now, "is not something you're owed because of your title. Respect is earned by the way you treat others, by the way you carry yourself, by the way you use your power. And if you think mocking my law degree earns you respect, then perhaps you've forgotten what respect actually looks like." Gasps echoed. The power dynamic had shifted. The giant, once smug and towering, was shrinking with every carefully chosen word. Crockett pressed on, the tempo rising. "You want to talk about dues? I've paid mine 100 times over. Every time I was told to sit down, every time my voice was dismissed, every time I walked into a room and was assumed to be less. And yet here I am, not because someone cleared the path for me, but because I refused to leave it." Her voice grew stronger, the cadence sharper, carrying the weight of 1,000 stories beyond her own. "You don't scare me.
and your laughter doesn't diminish me. If anything, it reveals the fear you won't admit, the fear that the next generation is here, and we will not bow." The chamber erupted, not with applause this time, but with energy, an almost physical vibration. Colleagues who had sat stiffly began nodding, the gallery filled with murmurs. On social media, clips were already being clipped, captions added, hashtags forming. Thomas tried to recover, but his words stumbled, his composure cracked. He adjusted his glasses, shifted in his chair, but the mask of control had slipped. Every camera caught it. The nation saw it, the giant wobbling, the power dynamic inverted. And Crockett, sensing it, delivered the blow that would echo far beyond that room. "You may sit in that chair until the end of your days, but power without principle is hollow. Titles without humility mean nothing. And when history remembers this exchange, it won't be your smirk they'll replay. It'll be my words reminding the world that dignity is not up for debate." The gallery could no longer contain itself. Applause thundered, spilling into the chamber despite efforts to silence it. Even some of her political opponents shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the tide had turned. Crockett leaned back at last, her composure unshaken, her point made. Thomas sat still, his lips pressed into a thin line. For once he had no comeback. The silence around him was not respect, it was the emptiness of a man who had tried to diminish someone else and ended up diminished himself. Viewers across the nation felt it in their bones. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reclamation. It was catharsis. For everyone who had ever been laughed at, dismissed, told they didn't belong, Crockett had spoken for them. Clips spread online within minutes. Headlines began drafting themselves. The comeback wasn't just sharp, it was historic. It was the kind of moment replayed on news cycles, on late-night comedy, on TikTok feeds. And just when you thought it was over, the aftershocks began.
The moment Jasmine Crockett's words left her lips, the chamber itself seemed to tremble. But it was outside those walls, in the digital arenas of the modern age, where the true earthquake began. Within minutes, Twitter lit up like a bonfire. Hashtags exploded across the platform. Hashtag degree of dignity. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Hashtag respect earned, each one trending higher than the last. Clips of her takedown circulated at lightning speed, trimmed into perfect 30-second bursts that made their way onto millions of screens before Thomas had even left his chair. On TikTok, users layered Crockett's words over booming background music, turning her pause before the final blow into a cinematic meme. Edits popped up with her calm gaze in slow motion, the caption screaming, "When you let them dig their own grave, and then you hand them the shovel." The sound bites became instant audio trends, teenagers lip-syncing her lines as though they were punchlines in a global cultural moment. Instagram flooded with reels, Twitter feeds filled with side-by-side comparisons, Crockett's poise against Thomas's unraveling smirk. "This is what leadership looks like," one caption read. "This is what fear looks like," read another. And Facebook? Even in the slower, older corners of social media, Crockett's words were shared by parents, teachers, and community leaders who framed it not as a partisan skirmish, but as a universal truth. Dignity beats arrogance every time. The validation poured in. Progressive voices rallied around her instantly. Politicians who had once kept their distance from Crockett now tweeted glowing endorsements. "This is why representation matters," one senator wrote. A congresswoman added, "Crockett just reminded the country that respect isn't a title, it's earned." Even a few conservatives, carefully hedging their words, admitted publicly that Thomas had overstepped and underestimated her. And then came the celebrities. Late-night comedians replayed the clip with relish, pausing to savor Thomas's faltering expression as if it were the punchline of the year. Activists praised Crockett for embodying the grit of marginalized communities. Singers, actors, and athletes tweeted their admiration, some posting her lines in bold text against black backgrounds, others simply adding fire emojis, as though no words could improve upon what she had said. It wasn't just admiration, it was identification. People across the country began telling their own stories, attaching them to her moment. Hashtags filled with testimonials. First-generation college graduates who had been laughed at. Immigrant professionals whose credentials were questioned. Women of color who had been silenced in boardrooms. They saw themselves in Jasmine Crockett's composure, in her refusal to be shaken, in her ability to turn mockery into a mirror that reflected the mocker's insecurity. The ripple effect grew wider. News anchors broke their usual tone of detachment, replaying her words with a note of pride in their voices. Commentators framed it as a turning point, not just for Crockett, but for a generation of leaders who had grown tired of playing by rules written to keep them small. One commentator declared, "What we witnessed today wasn't just a clapback, it was history catching up with arrogance." And Clarence Thomas? His silence in the aftermath became its own story. Headlines framed it as "Justice Mocked, Justice Silenced." Editorials questioned why a man so accustomed to dominance had crumbled in the face of dignity. Every still image of his fading smirk became a meme, circulating with captions like, "When you realize the camera's still on you," or "When the punchline punches back." But the most powerful refrain came not from pundits or celebrities. It came from the people themselves. Ordinary citizens tweeting late into the night, posting from small towns and big cities alike, repeated the same phrase in countless variations. The people have spoken, and they chose dignity over arrogance. It became the unofficial slogan of the moment, a chorus that amplified itself across every platform, every screen, every household. Crockett, once underestimated, was now the voice of millions who had been waiting for someone to say what she said in the way she said it. This wasn't just a win in a debate. It was a cultural reset, a collective reminder that arrogance doesn't age well, but dignity endures. And just when it seemed the shockwaves had peaked, another ripple began, one that would carry this moment far beyond social media, into the very heart of political and cultural discourse.
In the days that followed, as the viral clips continued to circle the globe, Jasmine Crockett's words began to take on a life beyond the chamber. They were no longer just a clapback or a soundbite. They had become a message, a declaration of values, and she leaned into that truth with the same calm authority she had displayed when facing Clarence Thomas. When reporters asked her about the moment, she didn't gloat. She didn't replay the insult or revel in the humiliation of her opponent. Instead, she reframed the entire exchange into something larger than herself. What we saw, she told the cameras, was not about me versus him. It was about dignity versus arrogance. It was about whether we measure people by the titles they hold or by the service they give. Her words resonated because they cut through partisan divides. They reminded people of something universal, that respect is not purchased, inherited, or guaranteed. It is earned, day after day, through resilience, through work, through integrity. Crockett made clear that her law degree, mocked so casually by Thomas, was not a symbol of elitism, but of perseverance. It represented nights of study, years of sacrifice, and a refusal to give in when the odds were stacked high against her. She spoke, too, of the people who had shaped her path, of her parents, who taught her the value of persistence, of her teachers who believed in her when others doubted, of the communities she defended as a lawyer, where every client's story fueled her determination. "My degree," she said, "isn't about status, it's about service, and service is the measure of a leader." That sentiment became the emotional crescendo. Americans watching from every background, immigrants, working families, students, professionals, heard their own stories in her voice. She was not speaking just for herself, but for everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, or told they were not enough. In that sense, Crockett's response became more than a viral moment. It became a universal truth. Resilience and intelligence outlast arrogance, and service will always speak louder than elitism. The patriotic undertone was unmistakable. Crockett reminded the nation that America's promise has never belonged exclusively to those with wealth, titles, or legacy connections. It has belonged to those who rise despite the barriers, who refuse to bow, who fight for others even when the system tries to shut them out. That, she declared in one speech, is the American story, and it is bigger than any insult, any smirk, any attempt to dismiss us. Her words uplifted because they flipped the script. What began as an attempt to belittle her became a moment that elevated countless others. The insult, once cruel, was now powerless. It had been transformed into a rallying cry, a reminder that greatness is not defined by those who mock, but by those who endure and serve. By the end of the week, commentators stopped calling it Crockett's comeback and began calling it Crockett's lesson. Schools replayed her speech as an example of composure under pressure. Churches cited her dignity in sermons about humility and justice. Families discussed it at dinner tables, telling their children, "This is how you face arrogance, with truth, with calm, with courage." And through it all, Crockett's composure never wavered. She understood that the true victory wasn't silencing her opponent. It was reminding the nation of what really matters. Titles fade, power shifts, but dignity, resilience, and service endure. The chamber where Thomas had once smirked now stood as a symbol of that lesson. What was meant to humiliate became history. What was meant to diminish became empowerment. And for millions watching, Jasmine Crockett's words became a reminder of their own worth. Because in the end, the moral was simple yet profound. Arrogance may shout, but dignity always echoes louder.
And so, what began as a smug insult meant to humiliate Jasmine Crockett ended as a cultural earthquake. Clarence Thomas's attempt to dismiss her education, her voice, her worth, wasn't just deflected, it was shattered. In its place, Crockett offered the nation a reminder. Service, resilience, and intelligence matter far more than arrogance, privilege, or legacy. The viral storm proved it. Millions replayed the moment not just for entertainment, but for validation. It became a mirror where people saw themselves. Every student told they'd never make it, every worker whose skills were overlooked, every immigrant whose accent was mocked. In Jasmine Crockett's calm defiance, they found proof that dignity always wins and arrogance always collapses under its own weight. But here's the truth. This story isn't just about one woman or one courtroom-style exchange. It's about all of us and the kind of America we want to build. One where voices like Crockett's are lifted, not mocked. One where power is measured not by privilege, but by service. One where every person knows their story matters. And that's where you come in. If this moment inspired you, if it reminded you of your own strength, your own resilience, don't let it end here. Share this story. Pass it on. Let it be the reminder that when arrogance tries to shout us down, dignity will rise louder. Because the world is watching. And the more we lift voices like Jasmine Crockett's, the more we remind the powerful that their smirks will never outshine our resilience. Subscribe, share, stand with dignity. Because in the end, history doesn't remember the arrogance, it remembers the courage. And courage, just like Crockett showed, belongs to all of us.